Questions. Questions are a big part of language learning, certainly a big part of language instruction. Today I want to talk about how I use questions and what I consider to be the role of questions in language learning. Essentially, I see questions not as a way of training my ability to recall vocabulary or grammar rules. Rather, I see questions as a way to trigger more exposure to different forms of the language, different grammatical forms, different patterns. And I see questions as a way to trigger me as a learner to speak, to trigger my output in the language. And I'm going to explain that. I have always been a fan, from when I was learning Portuguese, of the great and late Brazilian educator Rubem Alves, who said, "Nothing destroys the pleasure of reading, which is essentially a vagabond experience," and I'm going from memory here, "as much as being asked questions about what we have read." So I believe that the more we read, the more we listen, the more we engage with the language, the better we will learn. And therefore, we have to make that experience as pleasurable as possible. So if we are not inclined to answer questions, if we don't want to be forced to remember or to analyze the grammar in something we have just read, then we should not be forced to do questions. However, if we enjoy doing that, fine. Typically, the average language textbook consists of more than half questions and drills. And before we had Link, whenever I would use Teach Yourself or Living Language or any other textbook, Assimil, I would always avoid the questions, the drills. At best, I would look up the answers at the back of the book in order to see whatever pattern was being tested, to be exposed to this pattern in a concentrated way. Many examples of the structure or vocabulary item that's being tested. Now, I know that there's a lot of research out there on what is known as the testing effect, which says that being tested has significant positive influence on our ability to recall. So perhaps I'm just being a stick in the mud here, but my fundamental belief is that motivation and the willingness to spend the time are the most important factors in language learning. So if I or other learners don't like doing these drills in the textbooks, then it's best not to do them, and I simply don't do them. To some extent, in my mind, the testing hypothesis is in a way in contradiction with Krashen's input hypothesis, where he says deliberate learning is not as effective as the subconscious process of absorbing the language through lots of listening and reading, through lots of input. In other words, I have to make a choice. Am I going to spend my time on doing tests and quizzes and drills, which theoretically is good for me, but which I don't enjoy doing? Or am I going to spend that same amount of time by engaging in pleasurable listening and reading? Reading when I have dedicated time, listening when I'm doing chores around the house, combining the two through Link, for example, to absorb as much of the language as possible subconsciously. My choice, in terms of how I spend my time and how I maintain my motivation, is to focus on exposure, on input. So when I start in a new language, I typically do our mini stories where we have questions. We have questions after every story. But those questions have a specific purpose. Those questions are there for exposure. The question starts out with a statement, and then that statement is turned around into a question format. So you now are exposed to the question form of that verb, or how question sentences are formed in whatever language you're learning. The answer to that question is going to be either positive or negative, and you are given the answer. So again, you are exposed to the positive or negative form of that structure, verb and surrounding words that go with the resulting positive or negative statement. So in my learning, using the mini stories, which I've used for a number of languages, the questions are simply a diversified form of exposure to different forms of the language in a relatively effortless way. And finally, I would like to show you an example of how tutor Elahe in Persian uses questions, and she does this in every one of our sessions, as a way of triggering conversation. And she asks very interesting questions. She doesn't just ask me, what's new, how's the weather in Vancouver? She asks sort of probing questions about what do I think about different aspects of life or the world. She has a limitless supply of these interesting questions. And since I showed you one of these in my previous video about me learning Persian, I will show you another short excerpt of how tutor Elahe uses these questions to keep our conversation going.
یک سوال دیگه.
Okay, hoop.
به نظر شما چرا
Aha.
در جامعه قانون هست؟
Ja, در هر جامعه از جامعه حیوانات ها
خب حیوانات
یک شکل زندگی با همدیگه یک سیستم یک عادت وجود داره. The net result is that I never have to worry about maintaining our conversation. I know that I'll be getting some difficult questions, but I look forward to them, and that triggers recall. And this is the point, too. We don't have to trigger recall or train recall artificially with quizzes or tests or comprehension questions, which I don't like doing. We are also training our recall every time we are engaged in an output activity such as speaking, or if we do writing. And research shows that to some extent, when we're listening and reading, it's not entirely just plain recognition based on the surrounding clues of the context, but there is also a recall activity, a recall function in our listening and reading. So I think there are more pleasurable ways of training our recall and learning the language that don't necessarily involve quizzes, questions, tests, but I recognize that it's a matter of personal preference, and I always say, whatever you like doing, do it. Because motivation and your willingness to spend the time are the most important factors to language learning success. Thank you for listening. Bye for now.